Welcome back. This is part 3 of the Icon FJ44 Scale Replica Series. This is where we left off last time. The bulk of the brasswork on the chassis is now complete. There's still a lot of the finer parts to add, but I'll be picking away at these in later videos. One thing left unsaid last time, I added these steel suspension mounts. I tried several times to make these out of brass, but to get them this thin, they were starting to get a little weak, and I was getting concerned about them distorting or tearing under load. So I've chosen to go with these instead. They're steel Tamiya stays. They're a common parts bin item, a combination of 14th scale, semi-truck parts, and 10th scale Hilux parts. For now, I'm going to set the chassis aside, take some time to show you guys some of the neat stuff that's gone into getting this truck into mock-up. So the RC 4-wheel drive K44 axles were modified to this point by Chris Robinson at GCM Racing. As you can see in the on-screen reference, the rear axles had spring perches on the tubes. Chris took some time, machined these smooth, making room to allow for our new 4-link mounts. They'll attach here and here. Also, this is the most detailed part. This beauty is a one-off upper 4-link mount, and it looks almost identical to the one on the real truck. So this gets attached to the front here using the 2 factory bolts that holds the mount in place. These are the new lower link mounts. They get screwed into here using the factory holes. And the upper mount, it goes on here using these 2 bolts. So I have the 4-link mounts, the lowers, the uppers, and these screws will get used later on, mainly for caliper brackets and maybe some other tabs. It was decided, at least for now, this part will remain solid and not 2 separate brackets. I'll probably cut a relief into the top to give the illusion of it being 2 pieces, and I'll detail it later using different hardware and joints so it has a better scale appearance. From this angle you can see the housing's a very similar shape. I just have to go and build a Dynatrac cover for it. And the upper 4-link mount looks perfect from behind. It's a very nice detail. Also, some of these bolts will be scaled down and should make good mounting locations for things like sway bar end links and other stuff. Onto the back side of the front axle, this is where GCM left off. This is one of the spots we had to make a tough decision. You can see here that this is a 3-link setup in the front ends of these trucks, and in this photo you can only see the lower link. It's because the 3rd upper link that would attach here is actually on the driver's side. So in order to continue with these axles, not spend a small fortune on machining, new diff housings, tubes, etc., these elements will have to be opposed on our FJ. Here it's pretty clear the housing's way over on the passenger side, where our scale version is exactly the opposite. And the panhard bar travels from the axle here over to the mount on the frame here. On ours, it's going to be going from the driver's side over to the passenger side. These pieces still need quite a bit of trimming. They were just roughed in so I could figure out suspension geometry and stuff. We'll be working on rounding off the corners and trimming away any material that's not suspension mount. Like out back, the goal was to get as close as we could to the Dynatracs, and the housings look very similar. The axle tubes are pretty scale in comparison, and even the knuckles, while overly chunky, even look to be at the same angle. Once I get all the steering and other suspension components added, it'll distract from some of these inconsistencies, and I think it's still going to look really good. So again, thanks to Chris at GCM Racing for the work on the axles. There's much to do on them, but what a head start. I'm going to get them in the truck shortly. Next up are these wheels by Jim Log at Gearhead RC. I've used these on several project trucks in the past. They're called Soft 8s. They're a Delrin wheel that Jim created quite a while back. The standard issue versions had dimples all the way around the outer bead, but Jim took care of us and turned out all 4 plus a spare without the dimples. The holes, they come correct. They're 8-hole, they're a 6-lug wheel. Instead of these being sized at 1.9, they're a 2.0. Also, they're fairly narrow, so when you run a 1.9 tire on them, it stretches the bead a little, and with the right inner foam, it'll change the sidewall profile. So you just have to stretch them over, and then make sure the bead sits in place. As you can see, the tread pattern is very close to the real thing. The profile of the wheel to tire proportion is right, the sidewall bulge is there now. If I can just fix these sidewalls up a bit, maybe knock down the rough transition off these side lugs, maybe lose the RC 4-wheel drive raised letters, I wish these were licensed by BF Goodrich back in the day, but they're not, so we'll work around it for now. I have spotted a few photos of different tire options on the icons lately, and if there is something that I do feel works better, I mean, they're tires, they can be easily changed. We're also going to use these rotors from Integy and try to build calipers to use with them. They're just a hex replacement. They pop down into place and this groove receives the pin from the axle shaft. While they're only cosmetic, it's still neat to look through the wheel and have it appear like there's brake components back there. And once I had the calipers, the scale locking hubs, things pull together really well. Actually, I had just started this project when this had been released, so it's kind of old news now, but still pretty neat nonetheless. It's an all aluminum small block Chevy from RC 4-wheel drive. It's somewhere in the range between an 8th and 10th scale, and it was designed around a carbureted 2nd generation engine, so it comes with some pretty cool base level valve covers, intake manifold, heads, and other stuff from that era. It's designed to house a 540 size electric motor inside, and it runs into this single speed transmission, eventually making it to a 1.47 to 1 gear reduction at the scale transfer case. With a simple modification later on, I'll be flipping that over to help with our front axle issue. Okay, so the transmission housing itself has some unsightly elements, but I'm going to use a few tricks. I'm going to place some linkage and lines and try to hide some of that not so scale stuff. And while it's missing the inspection plate off the front lower transmission, it does have a nice little bolt-on oil pan. But I've got to dig into that as well, for two reasons. One, the upper suspension link doesn't completely clear the pan. Also, it's quite different than one from an LS. I'll be swapping it out, or at least merging it with something similar to this 3D printed piece. So for myself, the challenge isn't to get this to work mechanically. I can take care of that. It's pretty easy stuff. It's more the fact that I have to make this look convincing as an LS when you open the hood. Fortunately, I was able to track down Eric Harrell. Many of you have probably seen his videos. He's created a series of 3rd scale 3D printable engines. They've got accurate, moving, rotating assemblies, valves, pistons. Yeah. Because he so generously shared his designs with the world, I'm now able to use some of the files from his LS Chevy engine project. And this knocks off loads of time not having to model complex parts like this nylon intake manifold from scratch. So I went and did a few rough prints at 35% size reduction to get started. And while it doesn't sit on these original heads properly, and it really shouldn't, it does mate up to the new ones perfectly. I'm still pretty flexible with the engine stuff. I'll just modify as I go. I may try to use the original heads for heatsink purposes. If I do, I can combine the flange from the aluminum valve covers with the printed LS covers. Because of the motor heat, I'm looking at high temp PLA or maybe a nylon for the engine parts. And I will probably build an aluminum valley tray with a vent just to evacuate some of the heat from the enclosure. And for pretty much the same reason, I may or may not combine the aluminum heads with the modern printed ones. There's quite a few differences between the two style heads visually. Probably the most obvious is that on the older heads, the two center exhaust ports are up against each other, and on the more modern ones, all 4 are spread out across the head evenly. This brings us to exhaust. I'm planning on using Eric's header design as my foundation. I needed to check clearance between the fender wells, or where they will sit eventually, and the engine mounts themselves. These engine mounts are temporary. They'll be replaced later on once I have all my final measurements. Icon FJs run exhaust manifolds instead of headers, so I'll probably just build off of this flange and use the main tubes to get me started. But most importantly, they'll bolt on and there's enough clearance for the front engine mounts. Right now for the shocks, I'm using a set from Losi. These are an upgrade shock for their 16th scale rock crawler. So these are adjustable coilovers. They have threaded aluminum body, caps, and adjusters. They've got pretty soft springs and they will require some adjustment, but these are a very smooth shock, and as you can see here, they look much like these ones. In back, I'm planning on using a 16th scale buggy shock. Well, actually just the internals and the shafts. These will be combined with shortened housings from the MRC shock. That way the rears have matching adjustable coilovers. Up front, the standard shock length was a winner. I'll be able to fine tune the height later on, but there's no use doing that right now, not until I know how much the truck is going to weigh. Once I know how much weight and load will be on the dampers, I can spring these internally in combination with new outer coils. The internal springs will sit above and below the shock piston, so the amount of up travel and down travel in the shock can be controlled. so for today's purposes, we're just going to use them like this. It's just another good reason to use a jig. I can control the height and the chassis is forced into what will be its actual resting position. And while these shocks look pretty close, if I dig up a better, more accurate combination, I may swap them. But I do have a few ideas on how to make these ones look more realistic with scale reservoirs, lines, and hardware. So anyways, that's the plan for the shocks so far. Before we get cracking, I printed out these little mini wheel chocks. I'll link to Paul's page on Thingiverse if you guys would like to print some out for yourself. So first I've got to get rid of this sound. I'm just using some silicone tubing to make some shims to kill off the squeak. Just doing a little figuring on the front and rear suspension links. I've got these all labeled, the rears, the fronts, upper and lower 4 links, the front 3 links setup, with a panhard bar and steering linkage. These will just buy me some time until I can turn out some new stuff on the lathe. There's a good chance I'll be upgrading these end joints also. They're from a place called RC Channel, and while they look good, they're pretty loose. So far, they've got way too much play in them, so unless packing them with grease is magic, there's a good chance I'll upgrade them later on. Here we go. Well, before I toss this together, I had an idea to maybe up cat viewership by shaking up parts containers every once in a while. It was late, I don't know. Let me know how it goes. This brings us to the transfer case. It's an older unit from RC 4-wheel drive. As mentioned earlier, the front output shaft has to exit on the driver's side now because of our new front differential location. I needed to flip the output shaft inside the case. But once it's cracked open, all you really have to do is flip this shaft over and reassemble. A simple installation, 2 bolts through the brass crossmember and into the case. The engine and transmission slide between the rails and mates up with the transfer case using that huge, shiny sleeve, soon to be replaced by a much more realistic prop shaft. 2 bolts through the rear crossmember and 1 through each of the front engine mounts pretty much buttons this up. Hope you guys are enjoying the process so far. Thanks to the new subscribers and old for joining me. I know some of you have spotted shots of the truck at the stage on Instagram, so it's nice to bring everybody up to speed. Also, let me know what you guys think of the time-lapse sequence. There's less of my voice, which is nice, and of course it speeds up editing, literally, and way more can be accomplished with time travel. We know this. Okay, I'm going to stick a fork in this, and I'll see you fine people in part 4.